Jesus. Your sons and daughters stand up at this moment and they're confessing their storms. So Jesus, be with them. Jesus, guide them. And Jesus, I pray that this is the moment that they're going to know more about you. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. If you could sit down for me. Right now, our next thing that we're about to do, we're about to read Psalms together, just the same thing that we did last time for Psalms 23. If you have your wristband, we're going to do the color of your wristband. But if it's green, we're all going to read together at this moment, all right? So let's read together of Psalms 23. The Lord is my shepherd. He refreshes my soul. For you are with me. My cup overflows. Forever.
You can tell a lot about a person by what they're carrying in their hands. If you see a woman walk into a room and you're sitting on a table and she's wearing a white coat with blue pants and she's got a stethoscope around her neck and one of those little ear, nose, throat microscopes in her hand, you know you're looking at a doctor. If you see a man who's got a tool belt around his waist and he's carrying a nail in one hand, some nails in one hand and a hammer in another, you know that you're looking at some sort of a carpenter or a construction worker. If a person walks into the room and they got a gun in one hand and a badge in the other, you know this is a police officer. And according to Psalm 23, if somebody walks in carrying a rod and a staff, then you know that person is a shepherd. 23:4, that's our verse for today. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, these things that we carry in our hands are not just symbols either. They're tools. They're how we do the work that's in front of us. A doctor doesn't carry a stethoscope just for fun. She carries it so that she can check your heartbeat. A police officer doesn't carry a badge and a gun just for fun, but for the work that is in front of that officer. And the same thing's true with these particular objects. Now, we're going to keep our mind on these as we proceed and try to understand what's going on as we move forward in this. But let me back up, first of all, for a moment, because we've just kind of jumped in to Psalm 23. We just kind of hit it and ran. And for some of y'all, that's no big deal. You kind of grew up in church. You know how this works. Somebody like me says, turn in your Bibles to Psalm 23, and you know what to do, and we just sort of get to work. But for others of you, that's weird. Like maybe you didn't grow up in church and you don't really understand the church lingo, and somebody like me steps up here and says, turn your Bibles to Psalm 23. And you're like, what is that man talking about, you know? So I don't have time to unpack the whole of the Bible for you, but I know you got a lot of leaders who would be happy to answer any questions you have. But I would like to back up a bit to make sure we're on the same page. So the Bible, as you probably know, is one book that tells one story of the one true God who created the good world and is saving it from the mess we made of it. But this one book is kind of a library of books because there's a lot of individual books that make it up, 66 of them. And each of them has their own place and serves their own purpose in telling this one story. And the book of Psalms is one of those 66 books. It's the longest one. It's right in the middle. There's 150 chapters in the book of Psalms. And every chapter is what we call a psalm. It's like part song, part poem, part prayer, and it's all of these things together. And the purpose of the Psalms is unique. They're designed to draw us into a real relationship with God. Obviously, like you learn things from the Psalms, but the primary goal of the Psalms is not to teach you something that you don't know, but to draw you into a real relationship with the real God in the real world. And as a result, the Psalms are messy. Like anything that anyone has ever felt is represented and spoken for in the Psalms. Every single human emotion is there, everywhere from joy to rage to depression and despair to love to hate. It's all there, and they pray it out. And the purpose of this is that it gives you words to say. Somebody once said that most of the Bible speaks to us, but the Psalms speak for us. And that's what they're there for, to give you words to say that you can actually learn to relate and know and talk to God. That's what they're designed to do. And they work, but only if you let them. Only if you slow down. Only if we back up a bit and take our time to work our way through the Psalms bit by bit by bit, opening up our minds, slowing down our hearts to see what it has for us there. It's kind of like this. Imagine y'all ever been cold? Raise your hand if you've ever been cold, yeah? Imagine you're cold, and like let's say you're on a camping trip up north somewhere, and you're familiar enough with the outdoors, no big deal. It's cold, but you came prepared, and you're camping and hiking and tenting and these different things, and one day you decide for whatever reason you're going to go out on a hike by yourself. It's cold, but you're fine, right? You got the coat, you're good. But as you're out there, I don't know if you didn't check the weather report or the weather changed, it starts snowing. And you're not too worried by this, but you know that once the snow starts falling, it's time to make your way back to camp. But as you make your way back to camp, the snow starts falling harder and harder and harder until you realize you're in a straight-up blizzard. And you start to worry because you can't see the path in front of you because the snow's covering the ground and it all looks the same. And you're getting colder and colder and colder. Now, you've been cold, but I wonder how cold you've been. Like, there's phases to this, you know? At first, you're so cold, you're uncomfortable. And then you're so cold that you're angry. Y'all ever been so cold you're angry? It's like, I don't even know why I'm mad. It must be because I'm cold. And then there's a step beyond that where you're so cold, you're not even angry anymore. You're scared. So I want you to imagine that you're so cold, you're scared, and you have no idea how to get back to warmth. And as you're making your way through the woods, worried about what may happen and how you may be found the next day, you look up ahead, and just above the tree line, you see some smoke coming up. And you're like, no way, are you kidding me? There's a fire there. And you make your way straight toward that smoke line in hopes of finding a fire. And sure enough, in the middle of the woods, there's this cabin. And you see this cabin, and you notice the chimney, and you walk up to the door, and you look inside, and you can see a fire burning in the fireplace. And you don't know whose cabin this is, or whether or not they're in there, or whether you're going to have to beat the door down to get inside, but you don't care. You're going to get to the heat. And so you open up that door, and sure enough, it's unlocked. And you pull it open, and you run inside, and you stand in front of the fire, and you throw your gloves down on the ground, and you hold your hands out to the flame, and you count to 10, and then you turn around and walk back outside. Let me ask you a question. Are you warm? No. And is the problem with the fire? Not at all. Like, the fire's plenty capable of heating you up, but you got to linger by the fire if it's going to make you warm. And the same thing is true with the scriptures, man. The same thing's true with the Bible. So often we come to the Bible in bite-sized bits. We just roll up and read a verse or two, count to 10, and walk away, and then we wonder why the Bible's not doing its transformational work in our heart. And what I want to suggest to you is that the Bible can change you. The book of Psalms can draw you into a real relationship if you linger long enough for it to do its work. And that's why every morning we're not going to a new chapter. We're just going to keep reflecting on Psalm 23. Man, I love this chapter. And we talked about the first few verses yesterday, and the first few verses are they're like idyllic. They're picturesque. I mean, it's so sweet and calm and perfect. And you're talking about green pastures and quiet waters and sheep who are at rest. And it's this lovely picture of life. And we see this and we hear this and we think, I mean, that sounds great. But sometimes you see this. Some of you hear this and you think, yeah, that sounds great in theory, but that is not my life. My life is not green pastures and quiet waters. Maybe your life is chaos and fear. And I don't know where or what it is. Maybe school for you is a straight-up battlefield, and every day is like going to war because there's these forces that are coming at you, threatening to undo you. Maybe it's a bully that messes with you. Maybe it's the pressure that you feel to academically perform. Maybe you're just really lonely. I don't know. Or maybe it's not school for you. Maybe it's home. And you go home and God forbid your parents neglect you or even worse, abuse you. Or maybe your parents are good, but they're gone. Y'all, just a couple weeks ago, I went to this funeral for this woman in our church, 33-year-old woman. Died way too soon, 5-year-old son. And we're sitting in the back of this room, and about halfway through the funeral, this 5-year-old boy just starts wailing, I want my mom, I want my mom. And he's just crying. And I've never been in a place quite like that. And maybe that's your story. I don't know what it is, but the point is, y'all know, some of y'all know, that life doesn't always work that way. And if you don't, you will. Like, you live long enough, you find yourself in a mess. And you realize that there are external forces that are coming at us. And it's not just the external forces, but it's also the internal threats of our own foolishness. I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about me. And if you're like me, then occasionally you're the one that makes mistakes, that makes your life a mess. You make decisions that are foolish, and so it's just not always good. It's not always easy. Life is not always strawberries in Disneyland, right? And so you read a psalm like this, and you read the first few verses, and you think, I guess that's good for somebody else, but that's just not me. And the answer, as always, is, yes, it is. Just keep reading. Because then you come to verse 4 and it says, even though I walk through the darkest valley. Think about this with me. Think about how it frames it up. Even though I walk through the darkest valley. It's not if I sometime happen to walk through the darkest valley. It's not if you end up in the valley. It's when. Because the valley is a given. The valley is a fact. The valley is going to be a part of your story because that's just the way all stories go. So let's think about this phrase, darkest valley. It's kind of a tricky phrase to understand precisely because it can be translated in a couple different ways. Some of them say, even though I walk through the darkest valley. Others say, maybe you're familiar with this language, the valley of the shadow of death. And the reason is because it's not written originally in English, it's written in Hebrew, and there's a bunch of words that can mean slightly different things. We know that it's a valley, and we know that there's a word for darkness in there. And then there's another word that kind of sometimes means like deep darkness, but other times means death. And so it could be the valley of deep darkness, or it could be the valley of the dark shadows of death. Either way. And I'm not really sure it's that different, to be honest with you. I think we could go with either one on this and we'll get the point. And maybe if you think about the land of Israel, it could help. And I don't know if any of y'all been over there, but it's kind of a hilly area. Not quite like East Tennessee because it's not nearly as green. And there's not so much mountains all over the place, but there's all these hills. And so if you're a shepherd and you're leading your sheep through the land, then you got to be real careful because you can't see what's around that corner. It is dark to you, and therefore it might be dangerous. There's something out there that could get your sheep. And it's not just in Israel. I mean, this metaphor lands because the world is a dark, scary place, and you don't always know what's coming. Y'all remember being afraid of the dark? You don't have to raise your hand if you still are, but y'all remember, like, this is a normal fear. And it's because we don't know what's there. I didn't remember doing this, but so I got a bunch of siblings. I got 4 sisters and a brother. And one of my sisters is about 10 years younger than me. And a couple of years ago, she was telling me about how when we were growing up, she was afraid of the dark. And one time she told me, she was about 6 and I was about 16. And she told me there's this house in a room in our house. It was like our laundry room. And it was a little bit of a freaky room, y'all. I don't know if you got one of these rooms in your house, but it was always like weird smells and sounds are coming out of there. And like you didn't want to go back there at night. And it felt like the light wasn't working half the time. And it was just kind of a weird, freaky place. And so she says she was afraid of it because it was dark. And one time she told me this, I'm afraid to go back there because it's dark. And apparently when I was 16, I said to her, oh, Cassandra, it's not the darkness that you're afraid of. It's what might be in the darkness that you can't see that could hurt you. That's what you fear. It was like, that's a weird thing to say to a 6-year-old, you know? But it's true. And it's not just true of the laundry room, it's true of our world. There are forces out there that threaten your well-being. Personal forces, social forces, political forces, spiritual forces, stuff that comes at you. And if you're afraid, I don't think you're crazy. If you're a person who's worried about something, if you're a person who struggles with anxiety, I don't think you're crazy. I think you're paying attention. Because the world is a dark, dangerous, and scary place, and you have plenty of reasons to be afraid. But you have a better reason not to fear. That's the rest of the verse. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. I'm going to say it again. You have plenty of reasons to fear, but you got a better reason not to be afraid. And it's not because Jesus promises to keep you out of the valley. It's that he promises to be with you in the valley. The word of the day is presence. It's not that he promises to protect you from all these things. He promises that you won't be alone in them. It's like I picture hiking with Jesus. And you're working along the trail, and you come upon this sort of edge, and there's this like dark corridor, and there's this forest behind it, but you can't see anything inside it. And there's this sign on it. You know how the signs are on the trail sometimes. There's this sign that says, Valley of the Shadow of Death. And you look at Jesus, and you're like, hey, we're going to go around this, right? And Jesus says, nope, we're going in. And he just starts walking. This reminds me of my favorite Viking proverb. According to the Viking lords, this is what they used to say to young kids. They used to say, hey, just so you know, the cave you least want to enter is home to the dragon you must slay to obtain the treasure you most desire. They're saying if you want what you want, then you got to go through the ugliness to get it. And this is like Jesus' Viking lord moment, right? Except he doesn't just say, get in there and slay your dragon. He says, I'm going to be with you in this thing. The word of the day is presence. Because even though Jesus doesn't protect you from the valley, he promises that he will be with you in it. Because the question is not whether you will find yourself in the darkness. The question is who will be with you when you get there. And just because you can't see him doesn't mean he isn't here. This reminds me of just a few weeks ago, the first week of the summer, my family and I, my whole crew, we came out here actually to, not too far from here. We came out to Tennessee. We live in Joplin, Missouri, and we went to spend a week in the Smoky Mountains, and we did all this hiking stuff. It was a really fun week, and one of the things we did was we went down to this area where you can rent these inner tubes and float down the river, and so we decided we're just going to have this fun time floating the river, and so we get this all hooked up and set up, but the night before, my wife has a dream, and she has a dream about us floating down the river, and in this dream, my 11-year-old son, Carson, fell out of his tube, and he busted his head on a rock, and he's bleeding all over the place, and we're trying to get him out of the water, and we're trying to get him to safety, and then she woke up. She didn't sleep much the rest of the night. She told me about this in the morning. We're trying to figure out, what do we do? My wife has had some dreams that come true. I'll tell you about those another time. But in this moment, what are we going to do? And we decide, no, we're not going to be paralyzed by fear. We're going to go on this thing. We're not going to cancel it just because we're worried about what might happen. And so we go down there. Now, normally, y'all, in a situation like this, I'm just going to put my kids out there and say, go for it. And they told us when we got to the desk, they said, hey, we've had a lot of rain, and so it's not too wild out there, but there's some class 2, class 3 rapids, so you need to be somewhat careful. And normally I'm just figure it out, I tell my dude, get out there, man, this is part of the process of becoming a man, so figure it out and don't die, But on this day, I was not messing around. I literally stayed by him the whole time. I latched my hand onto his tube, and I never let go. I was not letting this dream come true. Now, I didn't tell him about the dream till later, but I was holding on for dear life. And we're rolling, and it's mostly chilling, but there's these moments where there's some rapids, and I look over at one point, and we're about to hit these rapids, and he's literally kicked back in his inner tube, hands out, chilling, eyes closed, just relaxed. And I'm like, yo, you got to hold on, man. He's like, what? This is so easy. And I'm like, I bet it is for you because I'm holding on for dear life. My head still hurts, and this was a month ago. But I think about him in that moment, and literally his eyes are closed. He can't see me, but he's not afraid because he knows I'm right there. I'm not going to take him out of the water, but I'm going to be with him in it. The word of the day is presence, because the question is not whether you will find yourself in the valley. The question is, when you do, will you be alone? And Jesus promises that if you belong to him, you are never alone. Just because you can't see him doesn't mean he isn't here. But we can't see him. It's dark in the dark valley, and that's stressful. And that's where these come in. These evidences of his presence. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You need to know what these are and what they're for because they serve different purposes. And these are the two things that a shepherd carries. A rod is something like this, about 2.5 feet long, hard enough to do some damage. Now, this is not primarily to be used on the sheep. Now, occasionally the sheep will feel this. If you got a sheep that's not paying any attention over and over and over, and they're walking on the edge of a cliff, and the only way for the shepherd to keep that sheep safe is to pop it in the rear, that's what the shepherd's going to do. He's going to discipline that sheep to stay in line. But the primary purpose of the rod is to protect you from external threats. It's to whack the wolves and the bandits that come at you. And in the darkness, you usually don't feel the rod. You hear it when it strikes the jaw of a wolf and shatters that sucker's noggin so that it's fallen on the ground breathing its last breath. This is to protect you, and you better believe Jesus carries a rod, and he's protecting you from spiritual forces of which you are most of the time completely ignorant. I promise you he's here, and I promise you he's got your back in ways that you may not be able to see. This, however, is a staff, and this is the thing that's primarily for you. This is how the shepherd keeps the sheep in line. And it's longer and it's thinner because it's gentle and it needs to have some reach. And so what the shepherd will do if the sheep starts to fall off the path is he'll just reach out and gently tap the sheep and say its name and pull it back a little bit closer. Or if the sheep keeps going, he'll just reach out and grab that sucker by the leg or put it around the side of its neck and just gently bring it back in line. That's the ministry of guidance and correction, and that ministry is alive and well today. And that takes us to this particular point in this particular week in your particular story. Now, I don't know what the details are of your life, and I don't know what Jesus is doing in it. Maybe some of y'all have been feeling the rod of discipline, the one that's not primarily to be used on you, but sometimes it is because he loves you enough to keep you from falling off a cliff. If you're living in open rebellion against God and you know it, you are probably experiencing some form of this. And I would encourage you to respond appropriately, to come away from the cliff, back onto the path, and trust that the shepherd has your best in mind. Now, for most of you, though, I don't imagine it's the rod. I imagine it's the staff, because you're just sort of wandering just a little bit too far. And I don't know what it is for you, But I bet the Holy Spirit's laying it on your heart. I don't know if it's a relationship that's unwise for you. I don't know if it's a habit that you formed long ago or just beginning. Maybe it's something you watch. Maybe it's something you say. Maybe it's this habit of not telling the truth or talking trash about people who you pretend to care about. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a pattern of thinking that you've started to imagine yourself doing things that you know are not honoring to God, but they sure seem fun in the moment, and you haven't yet stepped across that line, but you're thinking about it. And I'm telling you right now, what you feel in your heart and in your mind, this little voice, this little prodding saying, hey, would you come back in line? That's Jesus through the Spirit in you. The Spirit's laying something on your heart this week and asking you how you're going to respond. And I can't decide for you, and nobody else can either. Only you can decide what you're going to do in response to the presence of your shepherd calling you back home. You find protection in his presence because his presence pulls you back in from the other places where you may find yourself ending up. There's one more thing I got to tell you about this psalm, one more detail I need to draw your attention to. It's my favorite detail. I didn't notice this till about 2 years ago, and I've been thinking about it ever since. And I'm going to be real with y'all. I don't know if I fully comprehend all of what this means. I'm still kind of reflecting on the mystery of what's going on here, but I got to show you this. It's the pronouns. Maybe you noticed, maybe you didn't, but there's a shift in the way the shepherd is described. In the first few verses, the shepherd is described in third person. He. He leads me. He guides me. He refreshes. And in the second part of the psalm, it's you. You are with me. You prepare a table for me. You anoint my head with oil. And what I find especially profound about this is that whenever we're in the phase of the psalm that's about Jesus leading us to happy places, we're talking about he. But then when we find ourselves in the part of the psalm that's talking about Jesus leading us through the dark, scary, dangerous places, all of a sudden we're talking about you. Now, maybe this week you've been in this place where you're looking at Jesus from a little bit of a distance. He. And the invitation now is to look at him directly. You. And to talk to him and to engage him. You and him doing work. Now, I don't understand quite the depths of this mystery, but I do think there's something about how, you find yourself in the darkness and you realize that none of the other stuff you've been trying works for you. And maybe that's the moment when you finally look up in desperation and say, Jesus, I need you because I can't do this on my own. I think some of what's going on here is that the deeper the darkness, the more it feels like he's nowhere around you. But I need to tell you that your feelings are not a reliable guide to the truth. Just because you can't feel him doesn't mean he isn't here. As they say, the darker the valley, the closer the Lord. And just because he's invisible to your literal eyes doesn't mean he's not in the room. So may we sense the presence of our shepherd and respond faithfully. May you be comforted by his rod and his staff. May you have ears to hear and eyes to see that even in the darkness, he is here.